Plantation, I say.
I gave it to Jerry Brown.
Creveling's been around the county for a few times. He's a man that works underground most of the time, brings things up for us to look at, and gets some interesting stories to tell. So I won't take much of this time. I'll just tell you that we do have, or tend to have a break sometime after 8 o'clock when you ready to take a breath. We'll serve refreshments, so be an informal chance for discussion, and then he can come back and finish talking about it or take some questions as he sees. But Mr. Creveling, the room is yours.
Thank you. Good evening. Certainly glad to be here to talk about something which is a hobby of mine that I happen to get paid for, which is one of the nice things about doing archaeology for a living. I think what I'm going to do, since I'm going to be walking around with the slide projector, clicker, I'll probably sit down and give you a little brief talk about what archaeology is and what we do in the county and the sorts of archaeology that goes on here. And then I'll go into showing you some slides of some sites that we work on here in the county with the History Division of the Park and Planning Commission. And also give you a brief talk on artifacts, how archaeologists use artifacts, how we impart meaning to them, and how they help us to solve problems and questions that we have about the past. So I won't be standing all night. I think I'll sit down. Everybody else is sitting down. But what my role is with the History Division of Park and Planning is I'm the manager of the countywide archaeology program. And the History Division is actually it's a fairly large outfit now within Park and Planning. We have approximately 25 employees. I believe 11 of them are full-time. We're located in Bladensburg. Our main office is at what's known as the George Washington House. Many of you may know it as the Indian Queen Tavern near Peace Cross. And we have a research library there, and it's where the manager and the program managers and secretaries where we're housed. And then, of course, we have several other sites such as Marietta here. But the History Division, we have 4 different what we call countywide programs. There's the countywide archaeology program that I'm responsible for. I have 2 part-time assistants and approximately 25 volunteers that help me with the excavations and processing artifacts and doing research. We have a Black History program, which was started in 1981, which I think is our oldest countywide program. And that is directed by Gail Thomas, who creates programs for the general public and the schools on African American history in Prince George's County. It's quite a popular program. It's been very successful. We also have the countywide interpretive program run by Christina Putsch. And Christina is responsible for working with other facility directors of the museum houses, developing exhibits, developing tours of the historic sites in the county, particularly commission-owned ones. And then our last countywide manager is Susan Hellman, who's in charge of the Research and Resource Program, which essentially is our library where we have a lot of primary and secondary resources for people who want to do historical research on many different subjects in Prince George's County. As far as facilities go, we have several that are operated as museum facilities. One of the most unique is College Park Airport, which is the oldest continuously operating airport in the world, located in College Park. We have a small airport museum there for people interested in aviation history. The Riversdale Mansion, which is in Riverdale, built by the Calverts in early 19th century, around 1803 or 1805, which has just been going through a very ambitious restoration project. It is closed for tours right now, but we'll be open soon. But there we can interpret the early 19th century in the county. Montpelier Mansion in Laurel, which is home of the Snowden family, built in the late 18th century. So one of the finest examples of Georgian architecture that could be found in the mid-Atlantic or maybe in the countries. So it's a very beautiful place. The Surratt House, which is in Clinton, Maryland, which is a mid-19th century house. It has several revolving exhibits about different aspects of Victorian times in the county, and also, of course, its connection with the assassination of President Lincoln. Marietta Mansion, where we are now, which many of you are familiar with, just the home of Judge Gabriel Duvall. And then Darnell's Chance in Upper Marlboro, home of Darnell and Carroll families of fairly noteworthy families in this county. That depicts more of an early 18th century Georgian house. So we have quite a bit going on with the history division, many facilities, and I think there's probably even a rack back there with some of the pamphlets on them. So I hope you get to visit some of them. What is archaeology, and why do we do it? Basically, in the United States, archaeology, there's basically two practices of archaeology, and that is prehistoric archaeology, or the archaeology of Native Americans, and historical archaeology, which deals with anytime after European contact with North America. It could be with Spanish or British colonies or French or whatever, but what's the unique about it is that in historical archaeology, the difference between that and prehistory is we have the option of using written documents and also architecture. So there's a lot more, I guess, material culture or things that we can look at that in some ways are more familiar to us than doing the archaeology of non-literate groups, because we just have nothing written. The focus on prehistoric archaeology in the United States, basically from about 35,000 years ago to present, and really only about 9,000 or 10,000 years in this area. As I said before, the historical archaeology begins with European contact with the various European countries that began to colonize North America. Modern historical archaeology is a multidisciplinary field. We draw very strongly from other academic disciplines, particularly history and anthropology. It can include the American Studies field, also architecture, landscape architecture, and even art. There's a lot of things that can come into play that historical archaeologists can dip into the basket of different studies and find something that can help them or help us with what we're doing. And in this country, historical archaeology has a very broad range. Basically, a lot of it has been the study of colonial America, or European colonists, but we also deal with things like frontier history, and that could be everything from St. Mary's City, Maryland, which was a frontier town in the 17th century, to the westward expansion of this country, which would include mining camps and various short-term settlements when European culture, or now this new American culture, was expanding. So we can study the unique aspect of frontierism. Urban development. In the last 20 years, there's been a lot of focus on what we call urban archaeology, and that studies the development of cities, the commerce, the trade, the reasons why cities cropped up in various places. Locally, I think a good example of two very strong urban archaeology programs is one in Alexandria, Virginia, which has been ongoing for almost 25 years now. And Pamela Cressy, who's in charge of Alexandria Archaeology, developed the unique concept about 15 years ago of the city site, looking at a city as an archaeological site, not just a group of individual sites, but looking at the dynamic of a city itself. Another place would be Annapolis, Maryland, where the University of Maryland has had an ongoing program in urban archaeology for the past 10 years, studying basically the rise and development of this very wealthy merchant class that became the aristocracy of Maryland, looking at the rise of basically the capitalist system that we use now. Also, urban archaeology, believe it or not, has been applied to St. Mary City, Maryland, which we think of as this little small hamlet that was just used basically for the affairs of the state legislature for a few months out of the year, and then basically became kind of a sleepy backwater. Well, it turns out through the interest in what the folks in Annapolis had been doing by studying the street plan and determining that it was a Baroque street plan. It was actually a planned city. St. Mary City also, 60, 70 years earlier, was a planned city, probably drawing off a Baroque plan. So you're not just seeing a frontier settlement out here willy-nilly, you're seeing something that was very well planned out and meant to last. Historical archaeology, we get involved with various things like ethnic history, particularly in my case, studies that I've done on the Northampton slaves quarters is African American experience in this country. Also, archaeology has been done on Chinese mining camps in the out west, the mining camps and then the railroad camps. We only have what's been written about people, and a lot of things and mundane aspects of people's lives aren't written down. Sometimes you can discover things about folks by the way they lived and how they set up the way they lived. And that it also includes, I guess, the ethnic archaeology, such as even German barn architecture in Pennsylvania, things like that. So we're looking at a field that can draw in a lot of stuff, which also means that we never really focus on one particular thing. So you don't finish anything. You got all these neat things that you can go out and stuff instead. Battlefield archaeology has been popular in helping with some of the national battlefield parks, particularly the Civil War, War of 1812. There's been archaeology done at Fort McHenry and various other places like that. Also, we're involved with the physical restoration and construction of historical sites. And a good example where archaeology has helped is Williamsburg. There was archaeology begun there in the 1930s, and it helped to find out where various buildings were and streets were to help reconstruct this town of the late 18th century. Local examples would be something like Darnell's Chance here in Upper Marlborough, where various aspects of the way the house was arranged with outbuildings and landscaping, various things like that. And then information that's been discovered helping in the reconstruction. Historical archaeology really didn't get started in this country till the 1930s. And formal archaeology really didn't get started until the 1920s or so. I mean, people were working in Egypt, but the techniques I think that they were using might make us cringe today. But as a formal discipline, historical archaeology really didn't emerge until the mid-1950s. And the person credited mostly with that is Ivor Hume in Williamsburg, who was their archaeologist for some 30 years. He really put us on the map. Since then, the field has grown quite a bit. But I think one of the things that really separates archaeology, be it prehistory or historical archaeology, from the other disciplines like history and American studies, is material culture. And what is material culture? About everything in this room could be considered material culture. This table is material culture. The floor tiles are. Dr. Jim Dietz, who's the curator of the Lowry Museum at Berkeley, who's a very, very well-known historical archaeologist in this country, defines material culture as that segment of man's physical environment which is purposely shaped by him according to culturally directed plans. One of the things that, and the big tie to anthropology with archaeology, is that we're involved with the concept of culture. And culture is what makes us what we are, the way we dress, the way we speak, the way we think. Material culture are those things that we make, are the results of a lot of those thoughts. It can be anything from one of these pieces of ceramics to a formal garden to a book. Material culture can be things like letters. If we look at what Rosalie Calvert's letters from Riversdale have just been published, can help us learn about the sequence of construction of a building like that. Account books, say we're studying a plantation site, we can find out how much an owner is spending on things, work schedules, where are his slaves working, what are they doing, how much debt is this person in. Photographs are often very helpful, particularly, and I'm going to show you a couple 1936 Historic American Building Survey of the Northampton Plantation. But that is all, it's material culture. It's things that have been made and shaped by people and their ideas. Things like these artifacts, standing buildings are all would be included in material culture. Let me start with some slides. I think we're going to have to move this over a little bit. Oh, okay. I think we just need to move the carpet a little bit.
There are lights over there.
They're over here. Is that clear enough? Okay, great. I guess when I started, I told you that the History Division was located at the George Washington House in Bladensburg. This is our office. It's here. Many of you may recognize it from the Peace Cross area. The archaeology program, which I'm the manager of, began in 1988. I was the first professional archaeologist hired by the Park and Planning Commission specifically to do archaeology. Before that, John Walton, who's the division manager, and Kathy Allen, who's the assistant division manager, had conducted several archaeological expeditions. Both of them had some training and some work in archaeology when they were in college and after. So I'm not the first person to do archaeology here, but I'm the first person that was hired to specifically do that. But my role is basically to deal with archaeological and historic resources on Park and Planning Commission property. But I also advise other county agencies, such as the Historic Preservation Commission, which reviews plans for subdivisions and is concerned with standing structures in the county. Work with the Planning Board, advising them or answering questions. Other state agencies, such as the Maryland Historical Trust, which is an umbrella agency that in many ways that is a watchdog on preservation in the state. And I also work with the agencies like the State Highway Administration when they're doing road widening or something like that. If state money or federal money is involved, archaeology has to be done. I am not the person that's doing it, but I can help them prepare a proposal or see if a contract archaeologist's proposal to work there is a reasonable, those sorts of things. We also run a very, very popular volunteer program where folks come out and excavate with us on Saturdays, and then on Tuesday evenings they work with us in the laboratory processing artifacts and analyzing them. We've had student interns, graduate students, and places and folks like that. Now, why do archaeology? And why do it here in Prince George's County? People generally think of archaeology as something that's done in Egypt or done in Asia or in Europe on a Roman site. But Prince George's County, particularly Mid-Atlantic, is a very unique place and very good for people to settle because of its physiographic qualities. It is bordered, Prince George's County would be right about here, by the largest estuary in the world. So there's just a tremendous variety, and years ago, during the Native American times, a tremendous variety of animals that could be exploited for food. You also have the Potomac and the Patuxent freshwater. You have easy transportation, a lot of creeks. You're close to the fall line between the Piedmont and the coastal plain. The fall line goes right through area Silver Spring, Beltsville, kind of through there, where streams would cut through and expose various types of river and stream cobbles or rocks that could be used to produce stone tools. It has a fairly mild climate. Our winters don't get anywhere near as bad as some of the ones up north, and it's not oppressively hot. This area probably in Prince George's County and basically generally Tidewater, Maryland, has about 9,000 to 10,000 years of prehistory of Native Americans. And the Native Americans are basically divided into three groups. The archaeologists divide them, and that's the Paleo Indian, which Paleo meaning old or ancient Indian. We have the Archaic Group and the Woodland Group. And the Woodland Group would have been the rather sophisticated culture that the colonists such as John Smith and the Calverts would have found when they came up the Potomac. I'm going to go through a sequence of all of these and show you some slides on it. I think the main thing that separates these groups is environment and technology. Paleo Indians were from about 9,500 to 8,000 BC in this area. They were in basically what was a glacial environment. The last glaciation, I guess the Wisconsin glaciation, came down as far as what Long Island is today. So the climate was much colder. It was more of an Alaskan tundra type climate. Paleo Indians basically were small nomadic bands that engaged in what we call hunting and gathering. Hunting animals for food and for hides, for shelter and warmth, and then various plants for other part of their subsistence. Though it's depicted here that these guys are taking down a pretty large mastodon, we really don't have any evidence in the Middle Atlantic at all that Paleo Indians were hunting mastodon. This is probably from Paleo Indian was basically identified in the 1930s in New Mexico, in a place called Clovis, New Mexico, where they found what's known as a Clovis point, which is a very large spear point inside of a mastodon that they excavated, where they were able to date it with carbon-14 dating with the charcoal that was in the site. And that kind of established a date for North America. Don't really believe that the Paleos were in this area at that time. There's very few Paleo sites in Tidewater, Maryland, and the main reason for that is, when I showed you that geologic map, is in glacial times, a lot of the world's water supply was held in these glaciers. When the world began to warm and melted, the sea level begins to rise. There's, for the last 15,000 years, geologists have speculated that there's been about 1 foot of sea level rise per 1,000 years. So you're thinking 10,000 years ago, well, the Chesapeake Bay would have been 10 feet lower. The average depth of Chesapeake Bay is 6 feet. So Potomac would have been lower. A lot of these sites, paleo sites that may be there, are underwater today. So therefore we can't get at them. But Paleo Indians, hunting and gathering was what we call a seasonal round, where basically small family groups would go out searching either for large bison. Is that in focus? Can you all?
No.
It's not. It's about as good as it gets. They would do what's called a seasonal round, going to different areas in the land, in their territory that they roamed in, exploiting different resources at different times of the year. As I said, they were small family groups, but they did probably gather in larger groups at various times during the year, either to share what they found and basically to interact with other human beings. talked a little bit about how the difference between the Paleo and the Archaic and the Woodland Indians is mainly technology. Here we have 4 different types of projectile points. This was a fluted point, it was a Clovis point. This would be an Archaic, and this would be an Archaic point, a stem point. And this is actually triangular. I think that that's one of the major things that we use. As the environment changed, these people changed and adapted to it by developing and using new tools to react to that. Most of those points also were not always used as spear points. A lot of them were just plain knives that can be halved and used. You could have a kind of a multi-purpose tool. Well, the next group is the Archaic Group, which would have been from about 8,500 to 1,000 years BC. It's basically a continuation of the Paleo Indian period, but you get more specialization in activities, where here you have a specific fishing camp where fish are going to be caught, they're going to be dried, they're going to be stored. You'd have specific hunting camps. You'd have places where you would go to quarry stones for your stone tools. It's getting larger. People are congregating more often. New stone tools start to develop, like the ground stone tools. Maybe some of you have seen a ground stone axe, which is has a nice groove fastened in it. They're adapting to this new environment. The world is warming up. It's changing from an Alaskan type tundra environment to a modern deciduous forest like we have now, kind of an oak history based thing. So they're developing axes for chopping these things down. They're developing hide scrapers for scraping the hair off the different types of animals that they're exploiting. Then around, I guess, when is it anyway? The woodland period starts at about 1000 BC and would basically end by the time when colonists get here, because their culture disappears after 100 years or so. The main thing that separates them, these are basically the modern Indians that we know of, that John Smith encountered, that various other colonists encountered. The main thing that separates them from the Archaic and the Paleo is the introduction of pottery, about 1000 BC, and horticulture. They're beginning to rely less on hunting and gathering, more on starting to domesticate plants. They're able to store food. They're able to cook it in different ways. They're becoming much more stable. The horticulture, they're not required to wander as much, so they develop more sedentary cultures. This is a depiction of a stockaded woodland Indian village, probably in the mid-Atlantic, somewhere from about 1600. 1608, you have Captain John Smith. After settling at Jamestown, he began a very ambitious project to map the Potomac area. And, the Chesapeake Bay area, including the Potomac. Here's the Potomac. Point Lookout would be down here. Washington, D.C. is right up around here. Now, Smith recorded where various Indian settlements were, and he also had a little key for them. If they were just a settlement, he had kind of a circle. But if it was where one of the chiefs, or what was known as, I guess the term was Weirwants, which I can't really pronounce very well, he would put an Indian longhouse here. We have one up here at Nacotchtank, which is Anacostia. We have one down here at Moyon, where the Moyon Reserve is, on Piscataway Bay, and one over in Patuxent. So, Smith, all these other names are various Indian settlements that were discovered in the early 17th century. So you had quite a few people living here first. Here's a blow up a little closer. You can let me see if I can make that a little sharper. There you go. You can see he's depicted these longhouses. Here's my own. Here's the Nacotchtank. This is a little romanticized version of an Indian village. I particularly like the palms. This is what a woodland longhouse would have looked like. This is actually a 2/3 scale model of a house that was excavated around Virginia Beach. But all of the post holes were mapped and recorded. All of the deposits of shell, of chipped stone, where they were doing the various tasks around the yard, and how the building was set up. It's covered with bark and reeds. Basically, it's saplings about 3 inches diameter that are cut over, bent, and tied, and they make fairly substantial structures. Now, Native Americans in Maryland, and particularly Prince George's County, it's been felt for a long time, or thought, that they basically disappeared by the 1740s. And I think that's been proven to be not the case. Dr. Paul Cisna of American University in 1986 did his dissertation on the local Piscataway Indians and the myth that they disappeared. At various times, it was not good to be known as Indian. People changed their affiliation. Lots of folks did move in with a group known as the Kanoi. You have the Piscataway Kanoi affiliation. Many of them left, went up to Bear Island, which is close to Georgetown in the Potomac, and eventually spread off to different Indian lands and reservations in Canada and the Northeast. But a lot of folks stayed in southern Maryland, intermarried with the Africans that were brought here as slaves, and also some of the European colonists. There are several communities of people that descend from Native Americans in the county, and they began a re-emergence in the late 40s and early 50s when this gentleman here, Philip Sheridan Proctor, also known as Turkey Tyak, began researching his past, and I think did a very legitimate job of that. I'm not sure what the exact statistics are. There's supposedly about 35,000 Native Americans in the state of Maryland, many of them on the eastern shore, associated with the Nanticoke and Delaware people. Many Native Americans in Baltimore City who came here as Lumbees, the Lumbee Indians from North Carolina during World War II. We have a large group of them. And then the local folks that refer to themselves as Piscataway. So there is a continuing Native American population here. It did not disappear, and it is now being recognized, and I think legitimately so. Okay, why did folks come to Prince George's County? We talked earlier about what a nice environment it was. In 1634, the Calvert family and several hundred colonists landed at St. Mary's City to start a new colony. One of the main reasons they came was this plant right here, tobacco. The Calverts and various other folks had seen the successes in Virginia over the previous 20 years. Tobacco had become very much ingrained in European culture, and it was almost as good as having a money tree. The idea was to come over to Maryland, to make your fortune as a planter, and go back to England. But we know that didn't happen. The circumstances were a little bit different. Lots of people stayed, people that weathered the hardening times. As many as 2/3 of the people that first came died of the new diseases and malaria and things like that they encountered here. But tobacco basically shaped southern Maryland and Prince George's County. It was a very labor-intensive crop. It had to be tended almost daily. Each plant, leaves picked, bugs picked off them. But it's a culture that has really endured and is still here. Tobacco is still speared onto sticks and hung in tobacco barns. Here is a reconstruction of what a 17th century tobacco barn would have looked like in Tidewater, Maryland. This is in St. Mary's City. This reconstruction was done from architectural history research and also through archaeology, looking at barn foundations, how they were laid out. This is the same configuration of barn you can see today, and they're still building them. Tobacco was pressed into these barrels or hogsheads for shipment to England. In return, goods would come back. Many of those goods are on this table here. So what was a 17th century planter like in Tidewater, Maryland, and Prince George's County? This would have been the house of not a wealthy, but more of a middling or a middle-class planter in the early to mid 17th century in Maryland. It's a one-room house, about 16 by 20. It has a wattle and daub chimney, basically a mud chimney. It probably would have had a planter and his wife and a few children, maybe an indentured servant or two, all living under the same roof. These aren't these big sophisticated plantations that we always think of. Building completely made out of wood as opposed to the ground structure. This would have been a wealthy planter's house in the late 17th century, around 1690s. This is also from St. Mary's City, what is known as the Godia Spray Plantation, which is a fictional plantation that's been put together bringing together historical research and archaeological research. And in some ways it is an experimental archaeological site because they want to see how long these buildings will last. 95% of the buildings that were built in the 17th and 18th century were wooden. They're just not there. We have all these big, beautiful brick mansions. That's because the brick doesn't deteriorate. They last. They tend to be homes of wealthy people. People maintain them, so they're there for a while. But I want you to look at and consider and remember the architecture that you see here. This looks more like a medieval English cottage, doesn't it? It's kind of medieval looking with the mud, half-timbered chimney. It's got casement windows, which were probably imported. That is actually really a sign of the planter's wealth that he could afford to have leaded casement windows imported for his house. The way the yards are arranged, you would have paling fences, which are stuck in the ground, sticks stuck in the ground, dirt piled up to keep them up. You can find these sorts of things through archaeology to find out how yards are laid out and see what things people are doing. But over a period of about 80 years, we have a transition from this almost medieval, organic kind of culture and architecture to the beginnings of Georgian architecture. Now, after these planters became established and we started getting an imported and native-born aristocracy in Maryland, people wanted to start emulating the wealthy and the elite in Europe and particularly England. And one of the ways you can do that is through architecture. You can build houses like they have. If you have houses like them, then you are like they are. And this is one of the earliest examples of what we call Georgian architecture. Cut the building down the middle, it's symmetrical. It's the same on both sides. There is a whole philosophy that goes with this architecture and the placement of formal gardens and coming out of the Renaissance in Europe of being able to control and understand nature and having balance. A lot of this is incorporated into the architecture. This is probably one of the earliest known Georgian houses in Maryland. I'll just point out a few quick things. It has these raised brick edges called quoins and a projecting front bay. 80 years later, that culminates in full-blown 5-part Georgian architecture, such as at Montpelier Mansion in Laurel. This house was really a classic. But as I said, 95% of the buildings were wooden, and we don't see them today. They're gone. The only ones that we know about are basically through archaeological research. We do have descriptions, historical descriptions, but what do they become? Well, here you see this wooden building, oyster shell, a couple broken pots. Well, that's the beginning of an archaeological site. This is what it might look like 300 years later. A little scatter of oyster shell out in the field. This is down there off of Marlborough. Or an 18th century bottle base. just laying there. Or we have something this is a house called Melwood Park, down off Woodyard Road in Route 4. Looks like we've got a sidewalk leaning up to, that's the kitchen that's had some asbestos siding put on it, but on the surface it looks kind of like a pathway. When it's uncovered, we find it's actually a building. It may have predated that other kitchen building. This may have been the original kitchen for Melwood Park. And though we have no records of them tearing down a structure, building a new one, or building a new kitchen, I think archaeologically we might be able to say they did that. Here's the chimney base. You can see right here, there's a burnt area. Another thing that we've been doing, and this is a project that came out of the archaeology program, is we have a graduate student, Julie Ernstein, who's doing her dissertation in landscape archaeology. And she's trying to analyze 18th century pleasure gardens in Tidewater, Maryland. And through looking at different gardens at different mansions, she's trying to be able to create specific attributes that gardens would have, so she could predict where formal gardens are going to be and what they may have looked like. A lot of them were destroyed, but we may be able to reconstruct them. They tend to be very regular. Just as the Georgian architecture looks similar, the gardens do too. And there was a real rage in the late 18th century of these wealthy planners trying to out-garden each other. But it was also a sign of being a Renaissance person that these people corresponded with their colleagues. There's many letters between Snowden and Washington comparing plants and various aspects like that. Well, Julie is mapping in all the different falls and terraces, buildings such as the summer house, so she can see mainly, what this garden really is about. Here's a depiction of an 18th century garden with people strolling and enjoying themselves, and then of course the gentleman discussing their plants. Did a survey in 1989, Montpelier Mansion. The Friends of Montpelier contracted engineering science contract archaeology firm to do a survey of their whole grounds. So one, so that if they wanted to do future development, like recreate some outbuildings or put in another formal garden, they wouldn't be destroying what may already be there. In the survey, each one of these little dots is where an excavation pit was. And the ones with X's show where there were artifacts found. And then these areas show where different concentrations of artifacts were found. And this here is architectural materials. Well, we see we got something going on here. There's a lot of nails and brick and glass. And in this area also, and here's where they placed several test units. We may have had an outbuilding in this area. Except we had a problem, is when these structures were built in the 1930s, there are water lines and electrical lines that cut through here all the way through that area. So it was very disturbed. We found lots of artifacts, we didn't find any intact structure. Also, we looked at domestic materials. They would have been things like the ceramics and the animal bone and things, kitchen trash. Large concentrations out here. Well, we know that was the kitchen wing. They're tossing their stuff out here. But there's other concentrations too, where things are being deposited, where there's activity areas. So we know from now looking where the concentrations of the artifacts are in future excavations or future development, either to avoid those areas or do a little more excavation to try and determine what was there. Going back to the gardens, as I said, these gardens have very similar features. All of them seem to have the ramps, terraces, boxwoods, but they're not only are they formal, but they have a function also. Here you have a building incorporated into the garden. This is at His Lordship's kindness. This is a privy house. You had to have a necessary house somewhere, put in the garden, kind of hide it. It's off to the side. This is a 6-holer privy house. And it's built like a brick one too. It's very nice. Other outbuildings that you might find. This is a smokehouse at His Lordship's kindness. It was the closest thing I could find to what might be at Montpelier. But of course, this is a secondary 20th century use. I think they're using it for storage right now. The box suites, nothing like that would have been there when it was being used as a smokehouse. Another project we worked on with was the restoration of Riversdale Mansion, and there was some destruction that had to be done before they began restoring. And we had this breezeway and modern brick patio here had to be removed. We wanted to know though what the original entrance was like, because we had this big brick patio and everything. Turns out we got the foundation here of just a small set of steps. This went between the house and slaves' quarters and kitchen. It was not a very elaborate entrance. We also found something unique in the basement. First we went in, there's 4 inches concrete in the whole basement, covered every room. Had a contractor come in and remove that, and this very nice herringbone brick floor was there. But something else that was very interesting, and this is a whole system of drains beneath the floor to get the water out of the basement. And we have, as I said, there's letters with Rosalie Calvert. She talks about the horrible wet basement. I guess, I wonder if they had crooked basement contractors then too. But anyway, you can see that there's a whole system of drains through every room that funnels it to a couple exits that runs it out of the house. Archaeologists excavated it. And here you have a plan of what this. It's just a brick with a brick on its side and a brick cap. Here's a top view of it. That's all it is, but they're very extensive drainage system there. Another project we worked on was here at Marietta. I don't really have too many slides at Marietta tonight. I thought I'd talk about a couple other sites, but I do have some artifacts that I can show you that were excavated from Marietta here. We wanted to find out what some of the functions of the rooms were in the basement. This is outside what we believe to have been a kitchen. We were looking for things that might have been tossed outside. We found information out about this slide never does focus. About the construction of the building. It's on basically an ironstone foundation. We found what's known as a builder's trench, the trench that the bricklayers or masons would have got in. They dug it out and set the bricks in. If any artifacts fall in that trench while we're building, it gives us some kind of reference point to when that building might have been built. Fortunately, we didn't have any, plus we know when this building was built. Okay, colors and texture and aspects like that, but first thing we did was open up the stairway to this vault. Find out it's completely filled, packed to the top with dirt and brick rubble. We had 6 stairs going down and one unusual stair here. See, these treads are just 1 brick wide. That's 2 bricks wide. We don't know quite what's going on there, because that would be this stair here, or I'm sorry, right here. But it may have been easier to carry a coffin down that way. If you have several steps going like that, you got a rather steep staircase. This way it gave it kind of a break. You could put it in. But we can tell by the way the brick, the masonry is bonded, and the types of brick and the way it was laid up, that this stairwell was added sometime later. We don't know what the original entrance to the vault looked like. We don't know if they had a door here. We don't know if they had bars there, or it was just left open. I seriously doubt it was left open. I imagine they had some kind of wooden or iron door. But we uncovered the steps, and we started getting in here to try and find out what it was filled with and why it was filled. And right here in stratum A, we find the remains, not the remains, the whole thing, of a green shell edged pearlware sugar bowl. dates anywhere between about 1780 and 1800, probably very firmly in the 1780s. For anybody who's a ceramic nut here, it has a fruit top, which is supposed to be its real identifying characteristics. And then for anybody here who has designs on becoming an archaeologist, after about 15 years of field work, you end up with posture like that, so I would avoid it at all costs. But we kept going down in the burial vault, reestablished our grid down here so we could keep control. We started coming down what we thought was maybe a brick floor. Kept digging, exposed it, but it started to go down. And really kind of confusing. So we got it completely uncovered, and here we have a sub-crypt in the corner. We really don't, I'll get into the remains that we found and who we think they are. We really don't know who's buried in the vault. We believe Dr. Adam Thompson is buried here, one of the owners of the house. Dr. Thompson died in 1767. But we know that his wife, Lettice Lee Wardrop Thompson, and then she married again, right? Anyway, she continued to own the house for another decade or so. But anyway, we had this sub-crypt. The top of the vault looks like had fallen in. The roof was very shallow arch. Bricks fell in, knocked off part of it, so the hole was already open. Here's another little better picture of it. It had these buttresses up against it. And then we had the remains of three more people here. And you can see kind of the remains of the old hexagonal shaped coffin here. And the coffins were placed on top of the bricks to keep them off the floor of the vault, which was just simply clay. It wasn't brick or anything. Anyway, when we began fooling with the human remains, I am not a forensic anthropologist. I'm an archaeologist. We called in Dr. Douglas Owsley of the Smithsonian Department of Anthropology, and he is a forensic anthropologist. And his team came in and excavated the bones. This is Bob Mann's arm here. First thing we did is we took some photographs, and here's removing the skull. Bob was a brave soul. He climbed all the way in there and got everything. Now, we found no evidence of a casket, but we found casket nails. We didn't find any evidence of any textiles, any buttons, or anything like that. I talked about how death was viewed a little bit differently in the 18th century. Generally, you don't get any elaborate dressing of a corpse until the Victorian era. Most likely, these folks were buried in a plain pine box in a burial shroud, very much like a nightgown. In fact, they sold burial shrouds in England. You could order them, and the stitching and embroidery was kind of temporary. It wasn't real good, but didn't need to be. But so we could study how this the remains of who we were calling Dr. Thompson. Folks from the Smithsonian immediately began washing the material as it came out, and Bob would be in the crypt with several folding rules, calling out measurements to an artist who was drawing the bones as they came out. And this is how they were arranged inside the crypt. Now this is the most complete skeleton we got, and probably because he was in that sealed environment. The bones are very, very well preserved. Most likely, one, because there was all that rubble fill on top of it, denied it oxygen. Plus, there was a tremendous amount of oyster shell in there. There was bricks with mortar on them, which were made from crushed oyster shell. So there was a lot of lime in there to neutralize the acid. The pH of the soil here is about 3.2, which is acid. But these bones are in perfect condition, probably because of that, and the denial of oxygen. Also, here are the nails that we found along there, and they were plotted in where they were found. Well, doing some analysis at the Smithsonian, trying to determine growth pathology, what diseases that these people could have had, found some very, very bad infections in his femurs, had some kind of ongoing infectious disease, could have been tuberculosis, but what they actually think happened is it looked like this gentleman here, and I won't say it's Dr. Thompson, not to defame him, but he may have succumbed to the spirochete and probably died from syphilis, which was a very common disease at that time. They will also check the remains for any kind of heavy metals, like mercury, to see if they were treating people with medicines. Lead, lead poisoning has been, from ceramics and things like that, can be a cause of death. There was nine individuals in total were discovered in the burial vault. We had a man around 50 to 55 years of age, or excuse me, 49 to 55 years of age. We got a birth date, and Dr. Owsley's guess was he's 50 years old. Well, we got a birth date for him of 1716. He died in 1767. He was 51. So I think we hit right on the money there. We also had a female here who was about 43 years of age, and another female here who was about 21 years of age. But they were missing two key pieces of evidence. And we don't have skulls for these two. There's no fragments, anything in the vault. Probably removed sometime, obviously post-mortem, but before the vault was filled up. We have no idea when that happened, but from what we think, it had to have happened before around 1825. Also, was the remains a very interesting person, a young man or woman, most likely a young man, about 13 years of age, who suffered for some really horrible disabling disease. The child had, his spine was curved at a 90-degree angle, and several of the vertebrae, not only were we getting resorption of the bone, like osteoporosis, where bone is being resorbed by your body, to the point that it completely resorbed some vertebrae, and they're just gone. And he was probably pushed over. They could see evidence. Let me see if I have some of these. No, I don't have this slide. You could see evidence of where his ribs were pushed down because of that position he's forced into. All of his viscera is being forced down, kind of a little pot belly. The dentition is just absolutely horrible. Most people had very poor dentition in those days anyway, but may have been through, the kid had some kind of fulminating infection like tuberculosis or something, but anything to get the child to eat. Probably had a very high sugar pudding type of diet. These are all just really conjecture from Dr. Owsley as to why his teeth are so bad. But what may be useful here is when we go through family papers, letters, and diaries, if we can find any evidence of them taking care of an invalid, because obviously this person was an invalid, we may be able to find out who that was and what family, and the many families that Darnell's chance belonged to. This is one of the key volunteers, Ivy Henson, who worked at the burial vault between January and April of 1990. I had about 5 volunteers that gave me 900 hours of time. Folks would come out 3 days a week, and it was a good crew, and they got a lot of work done. Continued, found one kind of stray person over here. I think we determined that was an adolescent around 17 years old eventually. Here are some photographs of the anthropologist at the Smithsonian analyzing the child's skull. You see how large his hand is, you see how small it is, looking at the teeth, showing possible age, those sorts of things. These photographs, these black and whites, by the way, are by Jack Boucher, who's the chief Historic American Buildings survey photographer for the National Park Service. He felt it was very important that we document this thing. And they're fantastic photographs. I think we figured out we took about 12 cubic yards of material out of the burial vault, which is anybody who's seen a dump truck, it's at least a dump truck load. What we feel happened is I talked about there were some outbuildings at Darnell's Chance. About 30 feet away, there's a foundation that's about 14 by 17 feet. It may have been an outdoor or summer kitchen. And what we believe happened, and next to this kitchen, is what we call a trash midden, which is basically a trash pile. The women or slave women, whoever was working in that kitchen, you're preparing meats, you're preparing, you're cracking eggs, greens, you take all that stuff, you drop a dish and break it, you toss it out the door. Over the years, this builds up into what we call a midden, which is basically a trash pile. It really made us feel that what we had was a kitchen building here. Somewhere around 1820 or 1825, the top of this vault fell in. Now the house, had been, as I said, had been owned by the Darnells, Carrolls. It was owned by the Wardrops. Mr. Wardrop died. Matisse Lee married Dr. Thompson. He died. Matisse Lee, Wardrop, Thompson's heirs sold the house in 1798, I believe, or 1788 to a Dr. Walter Story Chandler. The only evidence that we have of who's in this vault comes from that 1788 deed. And I'll read the excerpt here. And this was from Mrs. Thompson and her daughters, Alice and Mary, were still alive. And in that deed it says, they sell Darnell's Chance. It says, except for a small square of ground which covers the family vault, to which vault as a burying ground is said John Hawkins and Alice, which is Alice Thompson, wife of said John, and also Milburn Williams of Frederick County, and Mary Williams, would be Mary Thompson, wife of said Milburn, and their heirs are to have from time to time hereafter free access. This is what makes us believe that the vault contains the remains of Dr. Adam Thompson. Who these other 8 people are, we don't know. As I said, we had Dr. Thompson, who was about 55 years old. We had a woman about 43, one about 21, an adolescent, a child, and 4 infants. So we have a lot of historical research to do to try and trace down who these people are. But this leads me into artifacts. We had essentially 8 feet of fill in that burial vault. Well, where did it come from? Approximately a quarter of that fill was brick. There was also plaster, nails, lathing, and then all of these artifacts that you see up here with the numbers, they came out of that vault too. I'd say we got 10,000 to 12,000 artifacts from that vault. And they all are domestic materials. Ceramics, bottles, toothbrushes, buckles, sewing stuff, all the kind of activity that would occur around a kitchen. So that's why I feel that what probably happened is the vault became structurally unsound, it fell down, they had an outbuilding that was 100 years old almost by that time. It may have been in disrepair. They either took the trash midden or that outbuilding and they filled the vault. Why do I think before 1825? The newest artifact we have, last most terminal date, which is a type of ceramic called pearlware, which is this here, which you can take a look at, has a date from 1768 to 1820. Those are the dates it was manufactured. The last year they manufactured it was 1820. a very major change happened in the ceramic industry around 1820 when they changed over from what was called creamware and pearlware to what's called whiteware. And it was a difference in glaze. It was the same ceramic, the same body, the same style, but they changed the glaze to make it whiter, to more emulate the Chinese porcelains. There isn't one piece of whiteware anywhere near that burial vault or in that burial vault. All of the ceramics are, the majority of the ceramics are mid to late 18th century. And that's why, we really feel that this thing had been filled. You figure it's 3 families later after the people that owned the vault or built the vault, if they indeed built it. We don't know if the Carroll family or Woodruff family or Darnell family did build that vault. We don't really know. But those artifacts are more firmly in that time period. I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll show you a few slides of artifacts and talk a little bit about what we use them for, and then we can kind of informally go over the artifacts, and I think that'll probably take up our time pretty well, and of course have some questions. I know you saw these 4 cassettes and you thought you were going to see the slideshow from hell, but I'm not going to show all of them. Well, I was going to talk all about how we do our recording techniques and stuff like that. We have a catalog sheet where every single time you open up a square, it gets a number. You get the number of the square, the feature, the level number, the soil types, any comments, when it went into the field, when it came into the lab, all that stuff. Every time we open a different layer on an excavation unit, we fill out a form which gives us the elevations of all 4 corners, a definition of that strata, usually with a soil description and a color description and what's in it. Say it was a fine sandy loam with brick fragments and oyster shell. That information would be here. A feature is like an artifact. An artifact you can pick up and move. A feature is an artifact like a building foundation that you can't move. It's man-made, but that's why we call them features. So you'd be a description if you had feature 32, which is the southwest wall of XX building. That would be there. The types of artifacts you found. So you can do a quick flip through. Well, we're getting ceramics, we're getting nails, we're getting oyster shell. Or we got, a pop top and a cigarette butt. You can look at it and it lets you know, well, maybe it's disturbed there. Let's look it over. And then an interpretation, what you feel it is. There's a bag number, catalog number, the photographic information, what roll it is, what frame, and then check it. The drawing, there would have been a grid on the back where the drawing goes. This is a similar form for a feature, just that large artifact. You might have the drawing of the foundation here and what surrounds it, and then all that same information. I like an analogy that one of my professors used, that excavating an archaeological site is like cutting hair. Once you cut it off, you can't put it back. So you have to be very meticulous with your note-taking, with your recording, your photography, and now actually one of the most useful things that I found is the video. It's excellent for recording on archaeological sites. Sure, we could just go into a site and dig up all the dirt, put it in a big pile, screen it, and we have all these same artifacts. But they wouldn't be able to tell us anything about how they got there, why they got there, how they were used. They have to be, artifacts have to be in context for them to have any meaning. That's why I get a very enthusiastic teenager who will come in with a whole handful of ceramics and stuff that he's dug up somewhere, and they don't quite understand why I'm not real excited about it, because, well, I have objects then, not information. So that's one reason, something to think about, and why we do this recording. We basically have to reconstruct the site from our records. One of the main artifacts that we use in historical archaeology is ceramics, and this is not just for simply dating a structure or a site. You can tell a lot of things about ceramics. They tell us about consumer behavior. What are people buying? Where are they buying it from? What economic scale are these people? Wealthy people are going to be buying the finest porcelains in China. People, your average middling farmer or planter is going to be having a lot of storage type things, like these large milk pan, the stonewares, things like that. But the main use is the dating. This is a piece of what we call whiteware. We know it's whiteware because of the composition of the body, the glaze. There's a tremendous amount of information on the ceramic manufacturing in Europe and America for the 18th and 19th century. We have catalogs with pattern books, and we have pattern books that you can choose what pattern you want. Price lists, all kinds of things like that. There's letters between Josiah Wedgwood, and Thomas Wheeldon, talking about the glazes they're developing for their different ceramics, things like that. So it's really a good benchmark. We know that this has to be after 1810 because it's a transfer print, it's a decal, it's placed on there. Can't be earlier than that. We find that in a ditch, and that's the newest artifact where we can surmise that ditch hadn't been put there at least before 1820 or so. Here's two other vessels. This is probably ironstone, which begins about 1810 or so, which was a very highly fired ceramic. We have three basic types that archaeologists deal with, and that's earthenwares, refined earthenwares, stonewares, and porcelain. And a lot of the differences is the quality of the clay, the glazes, and of course how high the temperature was when they were fired. Earthenwares are the lowest temperature, stonewares are the next. Earthenwares have to have a glaze on them, so they'll be impervious to liquids like water. Stonewares are impervious to water. You can just have an unglazed stoneware. Porcelain is so highly fired that it's basically translucent. You take one of your fine pieces of china, hold it up to the light, you can see through it. You can see that light. It's been fired so high that it's vitrified and virtually almost turned into glass. A lot of the development of English ceramics were a direct result of trying to imitate Chinese porcelain. The Europeans did not have the technology to make porcelain until around 1800, 1820. They had to have it imported. So they experimented with different clays and glazes and things to try and duplicate, or not duplicate, but emulate the ceramics. This is a piece of ironstone. This is whiteware. It's a very glossy glaze. It often has these little cracks which we call crazing. Very common would be storagewares for storage like this. This is American blue, blue on gray. Very common. Find it all over the place. This was excavated at Surratt House. This is very heavily in the mid-19th century. We get the earlier stuff too. This is what's called tin glaze earthenware, or Delft. Many of you have heard of Delft. A lot of people associate it with Holland. The majority of the Delft ceramics that came to the British colonies were made in England by Dutch potters who had moved to England. But this is more 17th century, the kind of stuff that you might find down at Darnell's Chance. In fact, I've got a couple pieces of tin glazed earthenware here. Some of them are dated. Boy, if you found that in the site, you'd really be happy. Most of them aren't though. As I said, there's a great deal of information. Here's a catalog showing the different types of, well actually that's a chamber pot, but it gives you different rims, things like that. You find them, you can match them up to this stuff. It's public, it's not a mystery. And of course the different, more elaborate things. You know, you have the little pitchers and mugs and things like that. Another dating tool that can be useful is bottles. There's been quite a study of bottles in recent years, and particularly by the group that worked for the Park Service, Parks Canada, who have put out a real nice glossary on glass-making terms, and how they can be dated. Had a few little things laying around, but I got a slide of it anyway. These are 18th century hand-blown bottles, large bases, hand-tooled lips, probably imported from either England or Holland. This is more of a 19th century bottle from Surratt House, champagne style. Commemorative flasks, American Eagle on here. Very, very popular in the 19th century, particularly with, and a lot of ceramics with I guess for lack of a better term, democratic or motif with the American Eagle, the patriotic, exactly. Flasks too. They can be dated. Here is a very nice early 18th century hand-blown white wine bottle. A hand-tooled string lip. A lot of research has been done on them, the various shapes and where they've come from, so we can get kind of a fairly decent date. Here I have a couple wine bottle bases here that you can take a look at, and a lip to the top of the bottle. This is from that Parks Canada glossary, which can tell you a lot about your bottles, how they were manufactured, and there you can find out where it was. Was it in was it Europe? Was it English? Was it Dutch? Was it French? And these are drawings from an archaeological report on excavations at Darnell's Chance from that survey by a group called Mid-Atlantic Archaeological Researchers, which shows 3 different types of lips. So they're coming in from everywhere. Another thing that we can use to date things are tobacco pipes. Very good amount of records on the manufacture of pipes. We even have a lot of pipes, even had the pipe maker's insignia. I don't see any of them here, but a lot in Maryland we find an LE, stands for Llewellyn Evans. Yeah. Okay, thanks. One thing about tobacco pipes, they first started, they were smaller. In the 17th century, I guess I cut them off pretty good here. They got larger as time grew, bowls got bigger, and the stems got longer. Now, you find a tremendous amount of these little pipe stems all over archaeological sites, 18th century archaeological sites. And I can maybe dispel a myth now. A lot of people say that when folks were passing the pipe around, they just broke off a little end so the other guy would have a clean thing. Well, we kind of know a little bit more about, we know a lot about their sanitation and their concept of germs and stuff like that. No. If you drop one of these pipes, it shatters into 100 pieces. That's why there's so many of them. A lot of people like to make up romantic things about how things get there, but that's not the case. But what a scientist did, an archaeologist named J.C. Harrington, in the 30s, and then it was expanded upon by a man named Louis Benford in the early 60s, is he developed a regression formula to figure out how long it would take for the hole in this stem to disappear. When they start in the 17th century, the stems are shorter, the holes are bigger. Well, statistically, he figured out that that hole would disappear by the 1930s. Okay, so we can get a date range by analyzing the pipe stems. You get a bunch of pipe stems, you get an average or a mean diameter for them. You can get a date range of when those pipes were left there. Same thing with the ceramics. I didn't talk about ceramic dating, but we have very elaborate formulas of getting ceramic dates for a site where, say you have a piece of porcelain here from 1780 to 1820. Well, its mean date is going to be halfway in between there, 1800. So during its manufacturing period. So you get a mean date for each ceramic, and then you get a mean of means, an average of the average, and that gives you a range of when people occupied that site. Turns out it works very well. The pipes, the bottles, and the ceramics all complement each other very well. Different things for analyzing the pipes, the size of the mouth, the type of wall it has, whether it's got a heel or a spur on it, whether there's an insignia, things like that. Very useful artifacts. So what I can do now is if we turn on the lights, I can show you some of these artifacts and ceramics and the differences between them kind of informally. And if folks want to ask questions, why don't we go ahead and ask them? Actually, by the door.
When you showed the piece of whiteware that with the blue willow
Yeah.
Type piece, you indicated that transfers were 1810.
Probably maybe a little earlier, in 1790s.
But is that talking about U.S. manufacture, or is that?
No, that's English.
English.
That's
okay.
English. The ceramic industry in the United States really didn't kick off until about the first quarter, 1825 or so, in the 19th century. Now, they were making lots of local wares, stonewares, things like that, utility wares, but fine china and stuff like that is generally being imported. Of course, now, you know, by the late 19th century, you had potters in Philadelphia and Trenton. Trenton still, you know, Fallscraft comes from Trenton, which is basically a conglomeration of several potteries that are still operating. And then there's Lenox, of course, in New Jersey. That rivals any of the English or European or Oriental portions. Also, the colors of the transfer print. They started with black and deep purple. They didn't get into the different colors, figuring out the dyes and how to dry them until a little later on. The colors and the decorations can tell you a lot about the time that some ceramics were manufactured. Anybody else?
What do you do with all these thousands of artifacts?
Oh boy. Well, I just that's a good question. I didn't have a problem with what I'm going to do with them. And just recently, I received a small but generous grant from the state of Maryland through the Small Museums program to take several rooms in a mid-19th century farmhouse that we own, Park Planning there. It's called Cottage, and create a environmentally stable laboratory for them where we can keep stable humidity and temperature for the artifacts for storage. They come out of the field, they go to the lab, they're immediately washed. We get the grit off of them. Then we, after the washing is done, we catalog them, and that's basically identifying them. So many nails, so many pieces of ceramic, so many window glass, bottle glass, and then you identify the ceramics as to type. After they're cataloged, you would number each one of them individually, and I have some examples of here to show you why it takes so much time. Because a lot of these things look the same. These aren't marked, but you may be finding an artifact or a particular ceramic. You might find this piece in one layer and this piece in another layer. You might find it in another square. You want to be able to pull them out, see if they'll mend, see if they'll put together, but to get them back in the right place, they've got to have the provenience numbers on them, or the context that came out of them. Generally, that's a series of numbers that lists the site. We have what's called a trinomial system, where you use a number. 18 represents the state of Maryland because it's 18th alphabetically in the United States. PR, Prince George's County, and say, well, this Marietta Mansion. All right, how about here? Okay, we've got this site before Washington. It's 18 PR 140. It's registered with the state, so that you know, they know where the archaeological site is, so it can be avoided. Then the artifacts, after that, they're analyzed. We look at them. What can we compare the refined earthenwares to the coarse earthenwares? Do we have a specific site. You know, is this a dairy house with a lot of storage type things? Is it fine china? Is it coming from a very wealthy person's house? We're looking at artifacts, comparing artifacts from plantation owner's house to the overseer's house to a slave's quarters to see what's the difference in the material culture. Are there things that they have in common, or are there things that are different? Can you take an assemblage of artifacts and say, these are slave artifacts, these are elite artifacts? That's a lot of what the analysis can do for you. And then, of course, just simply dating your different features and levels and sites, things like that. So as one of my first archaeology professors said, I can make these babies talk. Anyone else?
Is most of this work supported totally by Maryland funds, or is the federal government involved?
In the county, various things. The projects that I work on, such as here, are through the Park and Planning Commission. The excavation, say, at Darnell's Chance burial vault really didn't cost the state of Maryland or the commission anything, because they're paying my salary already. It's one of the projects I'm working on. And then the majority of the excavation, the washing, the cataloging, and analysis is done by volunteers. My program couldn't exist without volunteers. It just couldn't be done. But a lot of archaeology is done because of different federal laws, highway construction laws. Anytime that federal money is used, an act called Section 106 is invoked, which requires up to 1% of the money of that project be spent on archaeology or cultural resource management. And you get a several billion-dollar highway, that's a lot of money. Also with the state, we receive state money to grant money to restore places like Darnell's Chance and Riversdale. They require archaeology because you're using state funds, so it's required that way also. But basically the budget for the archaeology program comes from the History Division and the General Park and Planning funds. And then, of course, the hard-working volunteers. Yes?
The first slide of tombstones in the woods, was that at Darnell's Chance or Northampton?
Yeah, that was, in fact, I forgot to mention that. That was a place called Boone's Chapel, which is down in Cheltenham. And Boone's Chapel was the first Catholic chapel that was sanctioned by the British government, I believe, after the restoration of the monarchy. Yes?
Don, we are having this on videotape. I would suggest you pick up some more artifacts individually and make them talk for the benefit of the videotape.
Okay, let's...
May I ask you one question
Yes,
before you
sure.
do that? How much training do your volunteers have? A person couldn't just start to do this without something.
Well, that varies. I have volunteers that start with absolutely no experience. I have volunteers that were college students and high school students that have been interested in it. I've had unemployed archaeologists that wanted to come to it. Or office-bound archaeologists that wanted to come and do it. We train people. We train them. Okay.
But perhaps you could talk about something.
Yeah, let me talk a little
from
bit about the
Marietta.
ceramics. What I can do is talked about the three different types: earthenwares, coarse earthenwares. This is a British ceramic. It's got a red base. It's got a black lead glaze on it. Ceramics very similar to this were manufactured in the United States, but we can tell that it's British by the type of clay. There's little inclusions of rocks and things in it. It's called Buckley ware, made by a gentleman, Mr. Buckley. I'm not quite sure where in England it came from. The majority of the potteries were around Staffordshire. These were used for like milk pans, skimming cream, stuff like that. Storage items. Stonewares. This is a gray stoneware. I don't know if this is an American stoneware or an English stoneware. It has no decoration that we can't really tell. This is definitely English brown stoneware. Probably, let's see. Yeah, it's English stoneware, brown and gray, and it has a date range from about 1690 to 1775.
Where in this county were these various things
All of
found?
these artifacts here have come from the burial vault at Darnell's Chance. Your other earthenwares, which we call refined earthenwares, would be things like these small ones here. This is white salt clay stoneware, which is a little highly fired. It has almost what's called an orange peel finish. When you come up, you'll be able to see it. It looks like it's been peppered with something, and that was when they threw salt into the kiln to help with the glaze. It glazed it, hence the name salt clay stoneware. And that would give you a date range of about 1740 to 1775. They moved on, at least English ceramics, trying to emulate the porcelain with a type of ceramic called creamware. And creamware was developed about 1768. Wedgwood is responsible for the development of creamware. It's also known as queensware because he sold a whole set to the queen. Therefore, he began advertising his ceramic as queensware. Very popular. Now, out of that, about 10 years later, in 1779 and 1780, developed pearlware, or what he called pearl white. Creamware is a little yellowish. This is not a real, this is a very old piece of pearlware. It's a little lighter. It's the same body, same paste, but the glaze is different. And the way they tried to whiten the pearlware was by putting ground cobalt in it. Cobalt is blue, and it's the same concept as bluing in laundry. Blue makes whites look whiter. They were trying to emulate this stuff here, which is Chinese export porcelain. You can see it's much whiter. And the export would have been from about 1780 to 1820. That was a really, really popular ceramic. Other pearlwares, they had different styles. You saw the green. They have the blue shell edge. This is much whiter. It almost looks like this porcelain here. A lot of it hand painted. We can tell this is 18th century. This would have been a little coffee cup. The same thing. There's little decorations on it. One of the things that you can see, and I don't know how well you can zoom up on that, is if you see in the foot, there's a little blue ring, and that's the accumulation of the cobalt in the glaze. So you see that blue, and you have a real good indication that it's pearlware. They also, pearlware also was decorated in the very popular bowls called Annular ware, which had bands that were annular bands that just went around it. And this is the most interesting piece of ceramic, and usually the most fun piece for school kids. This is called Dendritic Annular ware, or mocha ware. And the way it got that is, if you can see, there's little splashes on here, there's little squiggly lines. And they looked like trees, hence they gave the name dendritic. But that little brown squiggly stuff is a mixture of tobacco juice and urine. And they would mix it up and splat it, and it would go. So kids like that one. Some of the stonewares, you have this gray stoneware, German stoneware, decorated blue and gray. It's called Rhenish for Rhine, the Rhineland. And let's see, what's our Rhenish here? It's 1690 to 1775. So it covers a very broad date range. see this rim here, I can tell by the rim and everything already that this is a chamber pot. And if you look at how the curvature is, it could be about that big. Those are the primary dating materials. We have a couple of bottle bases here, 2 different sizes and shapes. What you see, these very pretty colors, is really the deterioration of this glass. It's the impurities that are in the glass. And it's called a patina. It's basically just breaking away. What we need to do is we need to stabilize it. You're chipping all over the place. We have a very early piece here. For an 18, this is slip decorated metropolitan slipware from the 17th century. This would have been a large, probably storage type thing. What else we got here?
Where are the bones?
What's that?
Where are the bones?
We got some, don't have any human bones with me. They're all at the Smithsonian. One thing I do want to say about the burial vault, we did not dig the burial vault because we felt it would be a fun thing to do. The burial vault was damaged. Water was getting into it. We had a groundhog that had designs on it for a home. It was filling with water, and we needed to repair it and restore it. Any time that you excavate human remains in Maryland, you must have written permission from the state's attorney's office, and a good reason to do it. Also, very, very controversial are the removal and analysis of Native American burials. Native Americans have strenuously objected to that. And anthropologists and archaeologists have very mixed feelings about that. One, because there's a tremendous amount we can learn about the health and demographics of past populations through the study of skeletal material, the burial practices, and things like that. But their religious beliefs need to be respected also. If I decided that I wanted to study demographics of late 19th century Methodists and went down to the local Methodist church and started digging, people would be all up in arms. But Indians are there to be studied as specimens. That's okay. Well, I think that, the Native American community has grown a lot and it's gotten much more politically empowered, and they're exercising their right. I think we may lose some information, but most of us are involved with history and anthropology, and it would be awfully contradictory to ignore a culture's religion for our own gain. So we did get a burial permit to do this. We will rebury the individuals back in the burial vault where they properly should be reburied. Though we are getting scientific information from that. We also contacted the families as much as we could. We have descendants of the Thompsons and Darnells that were aware that we were doing it. We advertised in a newspaper for 2 weeks that we were doing it. So people are informed. Yes?
I have a question for you on that. Do you have any kind of speculation as to what might have happened to the skulls of the 2 women that are missing?
Got no idea.
Do you think they could have deteriorated in there? Or
No,
was
I don't believe they deteriorated because they generally last a pretty long time.
Was there any evidence that I have to say perhaps an animal could have gotten in at some point?
That's possible. I imagine it was a curious person. Kids break into crypts now. Here you had one that fell open. I just really don't know. I think that if it had been smashed by the roof when it fell in, we would have found fragments of it, because we found fragments of all the other skulls and were able to match them to specific skeletons. These were just misses.
There was no evidence of the heading.
I don't think so. These weren't Henry's wives. Yes.
What happened to the wood? I'm surprised that the wood would have deteriorated in such a short period of time, archaeologically speaking.
Well, we found evidence of wood, the bottoms of some of the coffins. probably because they were down there on the floor and the moisture kind of kept the oxygen away from it. But I imagine when the coffins were just sitting there in open air is when they deteriorated the most in the first, 20, 40 years or so. You take a 2x4 and lay it out there for 10 years and you're not going to have much room that's left. Yes.
Your pieces of ceramic and so forth, you have small pieces now. For the cups and things, do you have the rest of the cup? I mean,
Well, we may say such with this.
because I would think if a cup broke, it would throw the whole thing there. If a plate broke, they would
That's
one
true.
piece, they would throw the whole thing. So you may have pieces, but you would have the whole thing if you.
That's true. And in most cases, I think, here you have 3 different sherds of this, obviously the same vessel. In most cases, I would say, yeah, you might find the whole vessel, though it's in pieces. But this is really a secondary deposit. It was first broken in the kitchen or in the house or in the yard or going between the kitchen and the house and tossed in the trash pile. 50, 80, 100 years later, it was scooped up and thrown into the burial vault. So those pieces may still be out in the yard.
You don't think that when the burial vault fell in, that they then used it as a trash?
No, that's a very good question.
Because I know my aunt used to do that on the farm. They
Sure.
got with pit and everything that didn't burn.
Fill up the cribbing.
They burned it, otherwise anything else went into the pit. So it filled out.
Absolutely. How do I explain this? Getting a little lost here. All of the strata that we removed had was very similar. There was only 3 different strata or layers in that burial vault. They all contained rubble. They all contained pearlware, creamware, the same time period of artifacts. So it looked as if it was all filled in one episode, not that it was used over several years.
Filled up so that
Yeah.
the bottom
Now that's
layer
how,
would
say, a
be
well
the
or something like,
earliest-
you
the
can tell
earliest,
even.
And then oh well, that's what they used. Oh, well.
Exactly. You can even tell time periods. You can have your 1820s period, your 1850s period where you dig the well because it fills up, it stacks up. But this was stuff that was spread out over the ground that they shoveled from another place into the vault. But sometimes, you will find whole pieces. But when you drop a plate or a glass, you find some of the pieces later
I
under
find
the
them
cabinet
all.
or with your feet.
You find